So my name's Adam Sulzdorf Liszkiewicz. The title of my talk is Unbound, Play as Ontology. Can everybody hear me okay? Thanks for sticking around for the last talk of the day. And of course, predictably, I'm sorry to say that my talk will run a little long. I'll probably take up 30 minutes giving this, so I apologize. And as an apology, I think I can only say that I live in Los Angeles, so I have no concept of time. That's what happens if you live there for a while. In fact, my living in a temporal dead zone means that the title of this talk has accidentally become a kind of sad joke. The second half of this talk was supposed to be a performative presentation of a piece of what I might call a mythopoetic scholarship on the popular computer game The Binding of Isaac, as an example of what a scholar might do if they hold an ontological commitment to the practice of play as ontology. Unfortunately, as soon as I unbound Isaac, he wouldn't stop talking, and he just went on, and I couldn't get him to stop. So I had to cut that portion of the talk in its entirety, because this talk is already too long as it is. The good news, though, is that you can find that portion of the talk online, and I will provide the link to that essay at the end of this presentation. In the meantime, let's begin playing with some ideas about play and ontology, and thanks in advance for playing along. So, most game scholars, it seems, are sick and tired of playing along with discussions of ontology and with talks about how we define games, and yet ontological problems continue to plague the field of game studies, such as it is. In their attempts to understand the meaning of computer games, scholars continue to define the computer game through competing enumerations of formal properties, such as narrative, rules, aesthetic, computation, in a counterproductive effort to provide consistency to their shared object of study. In this talk, I will argue that such consistency is impossible, and that this fact is, ironically, the key to unlocking not only a responsible scholarly approach to the study of computer games, but also a useful and, I hope, timely perspective on the acquisition of human knowledge. Now, scholars who work to establish a consistent object of study are, in the humanist tradition of scholarship, trying to generate knowledge that is shareable and that is testable. In other words, they hope to produce falsifiable knowledge. But when scholars and academics attempt to expand human knowledge through the production of falsifiable statements and hypotheses in relation to games, they're necessarily also making tactical maneuvers within a larger language game and sociocultural context, which I think is something that Paul Martin suggested. It's assumed that when a scholar creates a falsifiable definition of computer games, that they're trying to forward human knowledge in a principled way, in accordance with the rules and the procedures and the norms and the betting values or what have you of a well-established game. And at the heart of this game lies a value proposition of sorts. Scholars are taught that if they create falsifiable knowledge, or knowledge that can be shared and tested by other scholars, that they'll be making a positive contribution to a playful, massively multiplayer endeavor. In short, to play well with other scholars in the game of academia is to create falsifiable definitions, or so we're told. Now, ontology is in part the study of ontological commitments, of what we or others are committed to saying about games in the field of game studies. But more generally speaking, ontology is the study of what there is, of what exists, and also of what can be said to exist, and what can be said about that which we say exists. So what can or should we say about games? Now, pushing all of my chips to the center of the table, this talk will assert that scholars' desire to play well with one another and to create falsifiable definitions of computer games has ironically left them blind to the simple and strange ontological status of games. Simply put, games are difficult to define as such because games are definitions, and definitions are games. Further, it's also because play is the means by which humans and other animals define things and try to understand those things' meaning. To illustrate these points, let's all channel our inner Wittgenstein and play a little language game, or rather a game with language. We're going to construct our own definition of the word definition. Now, these are just two common definitions of the word definition, derived from two commonly used online resources. Number one is from Merriam-Webster Online, and number two is from dictionary.com. We'll just use them as a starting point. First, note that in both definitions of the word definition, the act of explaining something or making something more clear is a very important component. We all know this. Definitions are designed to be shared with other people so they can better understand something, right? So for our definition of the word definition, we know at least that it's an attempt to share something. But what? What are we sharing? Now, in these definitions, we're attempting to share meaning, but specifically the meaning of a word or a phrase. And we're trying to make that meaning of the word or phrase more clear, visually, let's say. Excuse me, geez. So let's say we're trying to share, it's the end of the day. So let's say we're trying to share the meaning of the words poker chip. Now, this could be confusing for a number of reasons. Perhaps the person has never played poker, or perhaps they're thinking of potato chips. Or in Europe, they might instead be thinking about what Americans call French fries. I don't know. So we try to explain what a poker chip is to this person. We say, let's say, it's a round, thin, red piece of clay, probably, that is used in place of currency in the game poker. It's not a bad definition, right? Unfortunately, when we try to put our definition into practice, we find that it fails any and all tests of falsifiability. Poker chips don't have to be red. Some of them are made of leather, in this case, or other materials, and not clay. Some of them have writing or symbols or numbers written on them. Some poker chips are square or rectangular, but at least we know they're a substitute for currency in the game poker, right? Wrong. Some poker chips have no monetary value and instead act as a score-keeping device, or a device for poker's betting mechanic. And some poker chips are apparently used to wish people a happy birthday. And some poker chips are, of course, used for eating. Now, ironically, this picture is an excellent example of how we take in meaning as humans. We try things out. We touch, we smell, we taste things. We forget that babies are experts in phenomenological analysis, or as I like to call it, phenomenology, which is the attempt to learn about the world by putting things in your mouth. I think this is a good definition for my made-up word, but it doesn't help us directly with our definition of definition, because phenomenology does not involve an attempt to share, and it's private. So what do definitions attempt to share? Well, we might say meaning, of course, but what's that? I mean, when we tried to share the meaning of poker chip and make it more clear to one another, we found, as Wittgenstein did, that there were no formal properties shared across the group of all things we refer to as poker chip, nor could we define the poker chip by and through its use. Instead, we simply ended up playing a language game. So is a definition simply an attempt to share a language game, or to initiate one? I mean, as scholars know all too well, definitions of words are at the core of many scholarly debates. I don't believe this is a productive place to land for us, primarily because it then begs too many tricky questions. What's a language game? What are its rules? How do we define it? Can I play? And then we quickly encounter the problem of something like infinite regress, or as the old woman might have said to Stephen Hawking, it's definitions all the way down, right? So instead, I'm reminded of Wittgenstein's famous exhortation, don't think, but look. That is, look at what we've been doing here today and all day, right? We've been playing with one another, with the meaning of words and phrases. Are we talking about criticism? Are we talking about interpretation? We've been playing with one another and recognizing that, in the end, definitions are just messy, confusing attempts to share precisely what we experienced, a playful experience. So here we are. A definition is an attempt to share a playful experience, like the one we just had with the word poker chip. I like this definition. Funnily enough, our definition of the word definition also seems to me to be an excellent definition of the word game. A game is an attempt to share a playful experience. So is a definition. In other words, the word game and the word definition can be defined in precisely the same way. So we've discovered here that games are definitions and definitions are games, and that it's through play that we define things, that we share meaning, that we determine what can be said about things. In other words, play is an ontological practice. Oh, good, my GIF is working. This strange framing of games in play as themselves ontological practices drives the work of numerous scholars: Wittgenstein, Goodsinger, Bateson, Derrida, Steinkuhler, a woman named Anna Nardo, whose work I encountered recently and who I've never heard talked about in game studies. Ask me about her later, she's brilliant. Who each use games as a lens through which they view the human acquisition of knowledge. Using this lens of play as ontology, scholars of games can potentially see the maddening inconsistency, instability, and subjectiveness surrounding their object of study in a new productive light. Not as a bug in the academic system, nor a flaw in their scholarly designs, but as a feature of computer game scholarship, as a condition of human knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, at least to me, as a kind of ontological commitment. So in the first half of this talk, which is, of course, the only half of this talk, I will continue to present the preceding arguments from this introduction in more general terms, and I'll engage the work of several early game scholars as a means of critically reframing the ontological foundations of computer game scholarship. And then in an effort to move from broad generalizations to concrete analysis, the second half of this talk, which of course will not appear in this talk at all, would have proceeded through a playful piece of non-traditional scholarship, a mythopoetic reading or interpretation or whatever of the popular computer game, The Binding of Isaac. Now, this game is notoriously difficult to analyze as it's a messy mangle of intertextual meanings and oblique cultural references, and it's also very difficult to play as an exemplar of the challenging roguelike genre of computer games. But by accepting this messiness and difficulty as the immutable condition of that game, The Binding of Isaac, and eschewing traditional expectations of consistency and falsifiability in our analysis, my hope was that we might begin to understand that the meaning of this game is found in and through inconsistency and messiness. My interpretation of this game is that it's a game about a scared shitless kid who draws as a means of coping with things that are beyond his understanding. And I think it took me about 100 hours of playing it to come to that opinion, and I might totally be wrong. Anyway, in this way, a playfully inconsistent analysis of this game could perhaps model an alternative to traditional computer game scholarship and even offer a viable new ontological commitment to scholars who seek to better understand the meaning of computer games. But you'll have to read the essay and make up your own minds. So, for now, I'll simply continue gesturing at play itself as a possible ontological foundation for the study of computer games. And I'm going to critically reframe several ideas and concepts that I've gleaned from early scholars of games. Gleaned, a word I like. It evokes harvest and the repeated plowing of the same field. Seems to me very appropriate here at a conference like this, right? Like many of you, I'm sure I've had to continually re-sow and re-plow the same field for quite some time in order to reap any benefits. And further, I've had to borrow tools from other disciplines and people, especially from the field of cultural studies as late, and fertilize my field with even more thinkers' ideas. I haven't harvested it all yet, and my field is still too large and too disorderly to view well through the lens of this bloated talk, but hopefully you'll forgive my exuberance and just continue to play along, even though it's late. How are we all doing? Everyone still okay? Thank you. You're all amazing. Okay, so for now I'll just follow Stuart Hall's lead and put some ideas into play. So beginning with the work of Gregory Bateson. I've come to understand play as an important evolutionary step in animal cognition. Now, this is to say that play precedes, for Bateson, language, logic, and human culture. And indeed, logic and language require play and could not be formulated without it. This is because play, for Bateson, involves animals signaling signals as signals to one another, i.e. as signs that do not refer literally to or denote an actual referent or object. This is in this famous quote, "The playful nip denotes the bite," says Bateson, "but it does not denote what would be denoted by the bite." Now, these dogs are engaged in abstract thought, but more importantly, it is paradoxical thought. It's a paradox of communication, like the phrase, "This is not an academic talk." Bateson's quote, and the dog's thought, is a paradox of self-reference, similar to the Cretan citizen Epimenides' famous declaration, "All Cretans are liars." In Bateson's sentence, the word denote is used in two different ways, which are treated as synonymous, making the statement logically inadmissible. In addition, Bateson's sentence is paradox on another level. The animals are communicating about something which does not exist. But despite this double paradox, animals play all the time and play successfully. Now, this simple but profound fact prompts Bateson to make what I think is a dazzling observation. Quoted here, "We believe that the paradoxes of abstraction must make their appearance in all communication more complex than that of mood signals," like grunts, "and that without these paradoxes, communication would be at an end. Life would then be an endless interchange of stylized messages, a game with rigid rules, unrelieved by change or humor." That'd be terrible. So it is not in spite of the double paradox of play, but because of it, that animals are able to engage in more complex communicative acts. As Bateson says, the logician Bertrand Russell would not have been able to formulate his logical ideals, such as that of the infinite regress, were he not able to violate that ideal. Bateson also deploys the concept of the frame, around this dog's playing poker here, as a metaphor for describing how the cognitive process of play actually works. Like the frame around this painting, the frame of play signals where one draws the line between two categories or two logical types. Importantly, this frame is always necessarily permeable, i.e., the frame is understood as play by play. Again, I hear echoes of Paul Martin's talk in something like that. Bateson asserts that humans use actual frames, in fact, because they like to externalize their psychological characteristics. And perhaps most crucially for our game here, frames indicate in humans, quote, "a preference for avoiding the paradoxes of abstraction." This is to say that for Bateson, humans use frames and logic to avoid paradoxical thinking, i.e., play. Now, I've gleaned from Bateson the idea that play is fundamental to logical rational thought, and that such thought would not exist and would stagnate without play. But that humans prefer to avoid playful thinking to some extent, and that it can in fact make them uncomfortable. Further, Bateson has indicated that play precedes human culture. In tandem, these concepts suggest to me, first, that play is not only critically important from an evolutionary standpoint, but also from an ontological standpoint, as human thought stagnates without play. I'm thinking here about how people, when they get older, will often talk about playing games and how important that is to them, that the moment you stop playing games is the moment that you might as well just, go to a nursing home, right? Is this ringing true for everyone? How important? Okay. Now, second, Bateson's work is profoundly important to culture in that we must encourage people to play and acclimate them to that play in many situations, particularly if we value logical, rational thought. One only needs to imagine young students' disinterestedness around modern art, or their striking discomfort with and resistance to poetry, to understand the broader cultural implications. Poetry and art are places where deeply held ideas and ideals are played with, reconsidered, and sometimes presented as mere frames. To value poetry and painting, then, is to value a kind of playful thinking and an ontological commitment that makes people uncomfortable despite its deep cognitive embeddedness and profound evolutionary importance. Now, as a lover of poetry and a stalwart defender of rational thought, Johan Goodsinger's thinking aligns with Bateson's in several significant ways. Like Bateson, Goodsinger sees play as preceding humans and human culture. Play is older than culture, he says in the first line of Homo Ludens, and animals did not wait for us to teach them their playing. I mean, unless it's with a PlayStation or something. In addition, he also sees play as significant and as signification, as having a significant function. It's no accident, then, that in Homo Ludens, Goodsinger almost immediately criticizes previous studies of play in much the same way that I earlier criticized them, as always, quote, beginning from the assumption that play must serve something which is not play. Goodsinger rejects this outright, and with Bateson is steadfast in indicating the primary, irreducible, and significant quality of play, as well as its capacity for resisting analysis in a myriad of ways. Play is its own master. Play is irrational. Play is freedom. These are the fundamental tenets of Goodsinger's study, Homo Ludens. Furthermore, play cannot be denied. And this is a quote. You can deny, if you like, nearly all abstractions, justice, beauty, truth, goodness, mind, God. You can deny seriousness, but not play. Wow. When read alongside Bateson, we begin to see a portrait of play emerge in which play supersedes logic and rational thought, and perhaps produces and directs rational thought. Further, Goodsinger indicates that this originary capacity of play is not limited to logic and rationality. He says, quote, "The great archetypal activities of human society are all permeated with play from the start. So implicitly, play is presented here as a fundamental ontological practice." One might go so far as to use Goodsinger to revise the Cartesian cogito ergo sum by instead asserting, "I play, therefore I am." As Goodsinger states, you acknowledge mind in acknowledging play. Goodsinger also sees play as evolving, as Bateson does, from a simple kind of play that's common to all animals into a more complex play that only begins to emerge later in society. Then, he says, what was wordless play assumes poetic form. Now, he's interested in these forms, in the repetition and the rituals, and he sees in play an imaginative and expressive capacity, which imbues life with meaning. This is a quote, "In giving expression to life, man creates a second poetic world alongside the world of nature." The generative, poetic potential of play is a theme throughout Homo Ludens. Excuse me. So, the generative, poetic potential of play is a theme throughout Homo Ludens, as is his steadfast belief in the evolved forms of poetry and play. And that in those forms we find the refinement of human thought. And Goodsinger wants desperately to hold fast to those refined forms, those poetic forms, precisely because he wants to protect rational, logical thought. Now that Goodsinger is revealed in Homo Ludens as a staunch defender of modern Enlightenment thought may cast suspicion upon his definition of play, which is presented here. And indeed, that definition also ironically fails to meet the standards of falsifiability. It's strange. But this in no way invalidates Goodsinger's work. Quite the contrary. For if we simply locate and situate Goodsinger's thought within its historical context and free ourselves from the false prison of absolutist logic, we begin to see that Goodsinger, like everyone else, simply could not escape ideology. Not the ideology he used to resist domination and speak out against fascism, and not the Nazi hegemony that imprisoned him for 3 years at De Stieg in the Netherlands, just a 6-hour drive west of here, where he was eventually murdered in 1945. And he wrote substantial portions of Homo Ludens while he was interred there. Now, we cannot expect escape of him and his work, nor can we expect it of our contemporaries, nor of ourselves. As Stuart Hall says, or said, we live our subjugation not as theory, but as a concrete lived experience. For Goodsinger, the concrete was all too real. The play in the field too rigid in form, and the ontological commitments of others too serious and too brutal to change. Now, I live my subordination to ideology as well, as we all do, but the comparatively privileged position of my subordinating ideology offers, among many other privileges, the vantage points of cultural studies and postmodernism. This is to say that, alongside my intellectual interest in poetry and ontology, I'm also constantly on the lookout for that postmodern unholy grail, the impossible, where am I here? Yes, so I'm constantly on the lookout for that postmodern unholy grail, the impossible, circular, self-contradicting, paradoxical origin, the center that's not a center, the myth that both is and is not a myth, the new foundation for human knowledge that is somehow not new. With Bateson, and especially with Goodsinger, we begin to see the possibility that play, the fundamental but paradoxical cognitive process in human practice, which precedes and perhaps serves as the genesis of human culture, could be seen as an origin for an impossible postmodern map that has incredibly always been ready at hand. I find this inspiring, and I say so here to acknowledge part of my ideological frame, and also to echo Goodsinger's abiding belief that play and poetry can be places of resistance and freedom. Now, this is not to say that play and poetry necessarily are places of resistance, nor of any other particular value or goal. While Goodsinger saw poetry as inherently playful and as a kind of last bastion of play in a world of institutions drained of their play, it nevertheless remains the case that American poet Ezra Pound was a fascist. And Heidegger, who was a terrible poet, by the way, just horrible, Heidegger's exaltation of poetry and poetic thought must be read against his honored place as Hitler's favorite philosopher. So it goes. Now, all of this is to say that I agree with Brian Sutton Smith. Play is fundamentally ambiguous. And the primary problem one faces in studying play is that the bulk of play theories are, in fact, ideological rhetoric. Sutton Smith is hesitant to offer a definition of play in the ambiguity of play, in part due to the fundamental ambiguity inherent in play, but also in part because of the omnipresence of these ideological rhetorics. His is a scientist's perspective, and his caution is that of a scientist. I'm going to read this full quote, which is only partly here. In addition, he says, I must caution that the search for a definition of play at this time is a search only for metaphors that can act as a rhetoric for what might ultimately become adequate scientific processual accounts. While it is common to call such metaphors hypotheses to dignify the undertaking as a scientific one, the truth of the matter is that what I produce here is a metaphorical melange representing the possibility of a truth yet to be discovered. A cynic might say that most of social science is a play of metaphors aspiring to be measurable processes. Since the scholars who create these metaphors hope to take the next steps towards science, we cannot say that they are merely poets or players. Their intentions absolve them from the charge that this is only a language game. You want me to start cutting it short? Okay. So, yeah. So one need not be a scientist or draw the same conclusions to glean an incredible wealth of fertile ideas from this paragraph. Sutton Smith here asserts the value of metaphorical melange as part of a knowledge-seeking practice oriented toward truth yet to be discovered. Further, he offers the intent behind the practice, one might call it an orientation, as a means of validating that practice, i.e. the seeking of knowledge validates the seeking as a kind of self-reflexive loop. And while he denigrates poetry and play here, I must forgive him his own flourish of ideological rhetoric, for as a recovering social scientist myself, I'm well aware of the need to defend the serious scientific underpinnings of social science, especially when speaking to power. That Sutton Smith is aware of the poetic, playful aspects of his book is all the fuel that my ontological commitment requires. So I think I can move through some of this stuff because I know that we're short on time. Here I would have talked a little bit about the metaphors of choice that seem to, the predominant metaphors of choice for so many postmodern thinkers are appropriated from psychiatry, and that I would have discussed sort of therapy as a practice of practicing play that sort of emerges from thinking about Sutton Smith and thinking about Bateson as well, right? That the schizophrenic, for example, for them is someone who's incapable of playing and also incapable of stopping playing, right? And that connects in interesting ways to Wittgenstein's desire to stop doing philosophy when he wants to. I would have talked a little bit about Derrida, writing indifference. I'd really like to have talked about The Binding of Isaac. Who here has played The Binding of Isaac? 1, 2, 3. That's not enough. It's a wonderful game. It puts a lot of people off because of the grotesque imagery that you might see in it, right? And it can present as a game that's really more than anything else about a kind of remix of the Abrahamic myth of the Binding of Isaac. But the game is so much richer than that. And I hope you all get the chance to play it and maybe read what I had planned to talk about here, because I really believe that there's a kind of alternative criticism or interpretive practice or what have you that awaits game scholars, and that postmodern thinkers, that's all right, that postmodern thinkers talked about for quite some time, right? The mythopoetic, a practice of making myths which understands itself as a myth and a practice, which I would have talked about in another section. But the title of the other section I would have read is called When Did You First Play the Binding of Isaac? Henry Jenkins was kind enough to publish it on his blog some time back, so you can find it at that URL. If you want to search it through Google, I'd recommend putting quotes around it. Otherwise, it can sometimes be hard to find the direct link. And I'd love to continue speaking with you all. If any of you would like to stay after and chat with me, I can stay as long as you like. But for now, feel free to contact me through Twitter or email or smoke signals or whatever. We'll continue playing this game. And thanks again for playing with me and my ideas and for sticking around through this last long talk of the day. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Adam. Since unfortunately we're quite a bit over time already, perhaps we'll keep this to just one or two very brief questions. Anyone?
It's not a question, this is a comment. Thank you for a very nicely provocative talk. I do think you are confining ontology to those people who like to try to define games.
Who like to what?
Define games. That is not necessarily the case, since there are many of us who like to think of ourselves as doing ontology, but we don't think that defining games is what we should do. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's right. I think this is more, at least as its handshake, directed at that subset of game scholars, which I think is still predominant, that gets stuck on formalist or functionalist definitions of games and that sort of thing. But yes, I do think, especially among second and third wave game scholars, there are a lot of people who aren't getting hung up in that stuff as much anymore. I just think we need to recognize that those people are a minority still, and that most of them, in my experience, are speaking from a position that's lacking in privilege and lacking in volume. So, but fundamentally, I agree with you, I think.
Perhaps one last question. Is there anything from the audience?
Thanks. There's on Goodsinger, there's a beautiful essay by E.H. Gombrich about the relationship between his late work on Homo Ludens and his earlier work on medievalism, which he's really more known for in other circles. And it strikes me that what Gombrich claims is Goodsinger's kind of nostalgia for a pre-modern, playful culture of late medieval culture. Speaks to Feng's earlier ambivalence about neoliberalism and whether we can have an alternative kind of aesthetic project of self-fashioning, and that maybe this desire that you're expressing for a kind of aesthetic joy in knowledge production, as opposed to some kind of positivist agenda, is a sort of a postmodern moving back behind the Enlightenment to this earlier kind of aestheticized version of knowledge production that you see, for example, in scholasticism.
Right, or in Latour, for that matter. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think that you do find it in Goodsinger as well, right? His desire, or I think his desire, that's an understatement. His deep wish that war were not so serious, right? Or the, I don't remember if there's a direct passage in Homo Ludens about it, but the way in which we now lack institutionalized individuals who play, right? Like I wanted to ask Paul a question after his talk, if time allowed, about communities of interpretation that are tasked with regulation. So for example, in America, right, the Supreme Court we might call an interpretive community. And so it's a great shame that they interpreted the Federal Election Campaign Acts the way that they did in Buckley versus Vallejo and equated money with speech, which is absurd, right? But it's one of the many reasons, until Citizens United, why we're plagued with campaign finance problems in our presidential elections. Now they are an interpretive community, but the kind of authority and the kind of position they hold is very different from other communities. And I think if we compare that, for example, to a court jester who holds such a privileged place in the ritual, right, of a king's court, and whose job it is to take the piss, for lack of a better way of saying it, but you know, to do it in a very serious and very playful way. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here, but thank you, Adam, and please join me. Yeah.